I'm Jeremy Scahill from Dropsite News, dropsitenews.com. And I'm joined by my colleague, Sharif Abdel Kouddous, Dropsite's Middle East editor and reporter. And he has just returned from Lebanon and also southern Lebanon, where Israeli forces have very recently withdrawn in the most part. But they still are stating that they're going to remain in 5 separate areas. Sharif, welcome back from Lebanon.
Hi, Jeremy. It's good to be with you.
And Sharif also reported from the funeral of the late Hezbollah Secretary General Hassan Nasrallah. We're going to talk about all of that. But first, we're going to discuss what is happening right now in the Gaza ceasefire negotiations. We are speaking now. It's Friday, February 28th, and we are just one day away from the expiration of what is known as Phase 1 of the Gaza ceasefire and exchange of captives deal. And there still has been no agreement on moving to Phase 2. This situation is at a very serious crossroads right now. According to the terms of the deal that Israel signed, its forces were supposed to be, at this moment, withdrawing from the Philadelphia corridor close to the border with Egypt. That has not happened. Negotiations on Phase 2 of the deal, which envisioned all captives being released from the Gaza Strip, many, many more Palestinian captives being freed from Israeli prisons and jails. And most importantly, it envisioned a permanent ceasefire that would then move toward a reconstruction phase. Those negotiations about implementing Phase 2 were supposed to begin on February 3rd. And Benjamin Netanyahu violated the agreement. And instead of sending a real negotiating team to deal with this, as the agreement called for, Netanyahu goes to Washington to become the first foreign leader to meet with the newly reelected President Donald Trump. And of course, Trump infamously, at that press conference with Netanyahu, floated his proposal for the U.S. to seize the Gaza Strip to build what Trump referred to as a Middle East Riviera. And since those meetings between Donald Trump and Benjamin Netanyahu, we have seen the Israelis continue to violate the ceasefire. They have killed more than 130 Palestinians in Gaza since this so-called ceasefire went into effect on January 19th. Today, as we're speaking, the Israelis conducted a drone strike in Rafah. Other Palestinians were wounded in Israeli attacks. This has been an almost daily occurrence since the so-called ceasefire went into effect. You also have at the border with Egypt many mobile homes and tents and blankets and bedding that was supposed to have come into the Gaza Strip. 60,000 mobile homes were supposed to come in. You know, these are they're mobile homes. This would have allowed Palestinians to have some shelter. We already have had more than a dozen Palestinian children die of hypothermia, according to official statistics, since this ceasefire went into effect in January. You were supposed to have large quantities of aid that would have been vital for Palestinians to protect themselves from very, very cold nights. Almost none of that aid has been delivered. Now, President Trump's envoy, special envoy, his friend and a billionaire businessman himself, Steve Witkoff, is a complicated character. As we've said before at Dropsite, there wouldn't have been a Gaza ceasefire deal if it wasn't for Donald Trump. Joe Biden and his team showed that they were totally incapable of forcing a ceasefire, and instead of punishing Netanyahu for sabotaging it over the course of 15 months, they rewarded him by giving him more weapons, political support, diplomatic support, legal support to try to shield him from the International Criminal Court and other attempts to hold him accountable. Trump's a complicated guy. He sometimes does the right thing for the wrong reason. It's kind of pathetic that part of what we have to hope here is that Trump accidentally finds a way to not have Israel resume this war. But Steve Witkoff has shown an ability to kind of push back on Netanyahu that is quite different than what we saw when Brett McGurk and Antony Blinken and others in the Biden administration were leading the negotiations. So it's an unorthodox situation. Witkoff had said on the Sunday shows last weekend that he was going to be heading to Israel and other countries in the region, the key players from the Arab world for meetings. But then the next day he said he was delaying his trip. And part of what was at play is that Netanyahu wasn't even committing to sending a delegation to negotiate phase 2. Now, people who read Dropsite News are aware that from the beginning of this deal, Netanyahu signed. He has said basically, yeah, we signed it, but it's not a real deal. We only view this as phase 1. We're not going to get into the business of phase 2. We don't want to talk about reconstructing Gaza. And he keeps putting new so-called red lines in place. So when Witkoff delayed his trip, lo and behold, Netanyahu responds to that by sending a delegation to Cairo. And there are talks underway right now as we speak. They're indirect negotiations. The Israelis don't speak directly to Hamas, but they do speak to the Arab nation negotiators from Qatar and Egypt. So the Israeli strategy, as best as we can understand from the statements of the Israeli government, reporting in the Israeli media, some indication of what Trump's people are saying, is that Israel wants to really hyper-focus on this issue that Hamas needs to be entirely gone from the Gaza Strip as a starting point for the negotiations. Hamas, for its part, is saying, we're fine with not governing Gaza. We're fine with one of two basic solutions. That something that comes through the Palestinian Authority is authorized to have an independent committee in Gaza, or that there is a national unity consensus among Palestinian groups for how to govern the Gaza Strip. Hamas has said that they will lay down their arms if there is an actual security force that is under the banner of a Palestinian state that is able to defend their territory, but that they are not going to abandon what they view and what international law indicates is the right of Palestinians to self-determination and self-defense, including through the use of armed resistance. So that issue is going to be a major one, because this is what Netanyahu is saying is his red lines. There are, we understand, 59 Israeli or dual citizen captives remaining in the Gaza Strip. Israel believes 24 of them are still alive. There are many thousands of Palestinians, including some who are serving very, very long sentences, that remain in Israel's prisons or other facilities that the resistance groups have said they want freed. Public opinion in Israel is pretty clearly in favor of continuing the ceasefire because the Israeli public, for the most part, they want as many of the Israelis held captive to come back alive as possible. In a few days, there's going to be an Arab summit where the Egyptian plan that Egypt has been working on it's been reported as an alternative to Trump's Gaza Middle East Riviera. That's going to be kind of unveiled for the first time in more detail. There's been reporting about it, but we don't exactly know what it is. But we know that the bottom line, according to Egypt, is no displacement or removal of Palestinians from the Gaza Strip. The last thing I'll say on this is that Netanyahu claims he has a side letter from Donald Trump. He said he also had one from Joe Biden in the closing days of his administration, giving Israel the right to resume a full-scale war against Gaza if it believes that the ceasefire process has become untenable. It's possible that we're going to see Israel do some heavier bombing of Gaza in the coming days. It's possible. I'm not saying that I know this is going to happen, but it's possible that Israel will do some large strikes, but still continue talking and say, well, we need to get to a phase 2. That could happen. Or Witkoff and others could prevail and try to get initially an extension of phase 1, which would mean that Israel hopes to get more of its captives back without having to give up anything of substance to the Palestinian side. We'll see. There's a lot of big questions. But Sharif, one thing, you and I are both in daily touch with people on the ground in Gaza, and we also watch what's happening in the West Bank, where 40,000 plus Palestinians have been forcibly removed from their homes. Parts of Jenin, and not just the refugee camp, the broader Jenin area, now look like Gaza. The Israelis are systematically going in, ripping up the roads, destroying people's homes, giving them moments to leave with whatever they can grab. And you have what is very clearly a full-scale march to fully annex even more parts of the occupied West Bank. So, Sharif, before we get into Lebanon, and I know you've just come out of Lebanon. Your thoughts or some analysis of this moment in this process as we're on the eve of phase one of the ceasefire deal expiring and no agreement in place for what comes next yet?
I mean, it's a critical moment. When the so-called ceasefire went into effect in January 19th, it was the first kind of real reprieve, aside from a week-long ceasefire in November of 2023, from this genocidal assault, this deadliest and most destructive war of the 21st century. And despite the fact that Israel has violated the ceasefire, continues to kill Palestinians in Gaza, this is a very important thing, and we're on the brink of potentially it restarting. We saw 500,000 Palestinians return to the north, where the devastation is total. There's nowhere to live, there's no water, there's no food, all the agricultural land has been destroyed. And Israel is not allowing in mobile homes, not allowing in even tents, or not enough. And so, we'll have to see what happens. But I think, Steve Witkoff might join these talks in Cairo. I think he is a very interesting figure, and we'll have to see where this goes in the next few days.
Yeah, and on that issue of Steve Witkoff, I mean, he is on record as saying that he's committed to getting to stage two of this deal. He's not just talking about extension. Yes, he's saying we need an extension because clearly the Israelis sabotaged even starting the talks, which they were mandated to do under the terms of the agreement by February 3rd. But, again, Trump is focused on Ukraine right now. Witkoff is also working on the negotiations with Russia. But I do think there's some reason to believe that Witkoff's delaying his trip was in part a message toward Israel telling them you need to actually go and sit down at these talks. Before we talk about Lebanon, I'm speaking to you right now, Sharif, from Cairo. The Egyptians are a major player in all of these negotiations, along with the Qataris, the most important figures trying to mediate this solution. The plan that the Egyptians have put out is also a multi-phased reconstruction plan, but it at the heart of it is an idea of temporarily moving Palestinians in Gaza within the Gaza Strip and sort of starting toward the south and moving upwards to do reconstruction. We'll see how that's responded to by Donald Trump. The Saudis are also in this equation. Trump very much wants to preside over an expansion of his so-called Abraham Accords. He also wants to make a bilateral agreement with the Saudis. The Saudis are very interested in having a stronger security pact with the United States. They're interested in their own nuclear development. But you're in Cairo right now, and I think it'd be helpful for people to understand what is at the heart of Israel's rejection of bringing any Palestinians into the Sinai. The Egyptian government tries to portray it as if we do that, we're supporting Israel by displacing them. But there's other issues there, and you've covered this for many years. Summarize what's at the heart of Egypt's position on this issue right now.
Well, Egyptian President Abdel Kouddous has trafficked in the language of the Palestinian cause and saying that displacement is rejected and Palestinians need to remain on their land. But in many ways, Egypt is allied with Israel. It has helped enforce the blockade of Gaza for a decade and a half. It allowed Israel to conduct drone strikes in Sinai. And it was, a real force against Hamas, especially in 2013 and 2014. But I think the main worry of Egypt is that to have a large, restive Palestinian refugee population in northern Sinai, which could then, and Sisi has said this as much, which could then launch resistance attacks against Israel. And this is what we saw, in the 60s and 70s from Jordan and Lebanon, with Palestinians launching the resistance from those countries. This is the real national security threat that Egypt is worried about. And Trump has, threatened to withhold the aid to Egypt. Egypt's the second largest recipient of United States aid, second only to Israel. He seems to have backed off this position a little bit, and it's a completely unrealistic position also, if we think about it. Palestinians withstood this 15 months of genocidal assault, and they very triumphantly kind of returned to the north when the Israelis withdrew from the Netzarim corridor. You can't just remove Palestinians. They're not just going to leave. They're very steadfast in remaining on their land. So, this kind of plan was absurd to begin with, and of course, a clear war crime.
Yeah, and you also had recently the outgoing chief of staff of the Israeli military gave a speech to cadets in which, on the one hand, it's unclear, was it a joke? Was he sharing something with them? But said that they were kind of contemplating bombing the funeral of Hassan Nasrallah in Beirut, which we're going to talk about in a moment. But also, he made remarks about Egypt that were quite interesting, where he was talking about how Egypt has a very advanced, large-scale military capacity with submarines and warplanes, etc., and said that Egypt also has to be aware of potential threats from that Israel has to be aware of potential threats from Egypt. He said it's not right now, but remember last time they had the democratic election in Egypt and the candidate of the Muslim Brotherhood won. So Israel is also putting that on the radar.
I mean, look, Egypt has the largest standing army in the Middle East. It's by far the largest country in the Middle East with over 100 million people. Under Abdel al-Sisi, Egypt's become one of the largest weapons purchasers in the world. The largest purchaser of weapons from Germany. Receives $1.3 billion every year from the United States. One of the biggest tank fleets in the world. But I will have a caveat with this, that a lot of these systems are bought from Italy, from the UK, from Germany, from the United States. They don't necessarily work together, in terms of just the controls and the systems that need to work them. And a lot of these weapons purchases were done for political reasons, to shore up support from a country like France, which at one point was the largest seller of weapons to Egypt. We bought these Rafale jets that no one else was buying, and this was kind of to shore up the relationship between Egypt and France. As a fighting force, I don't know what Egypt's actual capability is, but it does have a very large air force, a very large tank fleet, but we are nowhere near a situation where Egypt would go to war with Israel. There is, that rhetoric from that Israeli official was I think, way off the mark.
Yeah, Israel is just like on a kind of arson spree in the Middle East right now. So, and they're saying all kinds of things, but unfortunately, especially with Trump in the White House, we have to kind of take these things seriously, even if our analysis suggests like the chances of this happening are very slim. Okay, let's transfer to Lebanon. You were just there. You went to cover the funeral of Hezbollah Secretary General Hassan Nasrallah, and the Israelis flew jets over that procession. And as you said in your excellent report you did for us in Democracy Now!, that people were defiant in the face of this menacing act by Israel. But the most newsworthy, in my view, part of your reporting from Lebanon is that you were one of the few reporters that managed to get in to areas in southern Lebanon that the Israelis had very, very recently pulled out of. And you saw scenes of mass destruction and devastation. And one of the people you interviewed said much of this destruction has happened since the so-called ceasefire went into effect. Give us a sense of your impression, having been in southern Lebanon, on what were the front lines of this solidarity front, as Nasrallah called it, against the Israelis since October 2023.
Yeah, we arrived to villages in the south that are right up on the border with Palestine. Just 3 days after the Israeli military withdrew, they withdrew in violation. They extended their stay. They're supposed to withdraw on January 26th. They violated the ceasefire agreement yet again and only withdrew on February 18th, and they remained stationed on 5 hilltop locations near the border, also illegally. But when we got to the first village, Kafr Killa, it looks like an earthquake hit it. There is no village left. There's not a structure left standing or that has been very badly damaged. And this was systematic destruction. It was far from any fighting. It's important to understand that, yes, much of this destruction happened during the so-called ceasefire. that went into effect in late November. The Israeli military detonated and bulldozed homes. And Kafr Killa, Adaysa, these villages are completely gone. They're completely destroyed. You could see the clear signs of the presence of Israeli troops. They left a lot of graffiti on the walls, sometimes in English, saying things like "Israel forever," sometimes in Hebrew, saying things like "burn" or referring to one of their engineering corps groups who are responsible for demolishing large civilian areas. And it was really kind of a shocking scene and eerily empty. Residents had been protesting on the outskirts of these villages, demanding their right to return to them. But there really is nothing to return to. But another reason that they were kind of empty was that a lot of people in the south, when we were there, had been heading up to Beirut to attend the funeral of Hassan Nasrallah. Nasrallah was killed on September 27th when Israel dropped more than 80 tons of munitions in an area where he was meeting with top commanders in an underground bunker in Dahya, in a southern suburb of Beirut. And they buried him in a secret grave, and they only managed to have a public funeral once the ceasefire kind of was in effect. And so a lot of people, hundreds of thousands of people, by some accounts, 1 million people attended this funeral. It was really one of the seminal rallies in the Middle East in many years. And I think people need to understand what a figure Nasrallah was in the Arab world. He became the leader of Hezbollah in 1992 after Israel assassinated his predecessor, Sheikh al-Moussawi. He was just 31 years old at the time. But under Nasrallah, Hezbollah grew from this militia into one of the most important players in the Arab world and into a formidable fighting force. They liberated South Lebanon from Israeli occupation in 2000. 6 years later, in 2006, Hezbollah essentially fought Israel to a standstill, despite being vastly outgunned, and this was viewed as a victory. And it was then that really Hezbollah and Nasrallah's stature soared across the Arab world. He was also a very charismatic and eloquent speaker, which is rare for Arab leaders in the world in this generation. And he pulled no punches in his anti-imperialist rhetoric. And whenever there was an announcement that he would speak, everyone would tune in. He famously, for example, during the 2006 war, he announced an impending attack on an Israeli warship, which then went up in flames as he spoke. It was these kinds of moves that made him into this mythical figure almost. Amongst Shia in Lebanon, he had a massive following. But of course, Hezbollah and Nasrallah decided to intervene in the Syrian civil war on the side of former President Bashar al-Assad, and who was a main ally of Hezbollah, a main conduit for funds and weapons to the group. But as we know, this was a brutal civil war, and Hezbollah's intervention spurred intense divisions across the Arab world. Where people who did support Hezbollah very much then pulled back that support because of his intervention with Assad, but they remained as a force of resistance to Israel. Hezbollah remains among the most potent, and we saw that again when they began firing rockets and artillery at Israeli forces on October 8th, 2023, one day after Israel began its genocidal assault. And, no other Arab nation except for Yemen really did anything. Yemen began attacking ships in the Red Sea to disrupt maritime trade. And then we saw how Israel escalated the war in September, detonating hundreds of beepers and walkie-talkies belonging to Hezbollah members, killing dozens of people, injuring almost 3,500. And, when you're in the south, you see these injuries. We saw men missing eyes, men with mangled hands, all as a result of this attack. It's still, it's very kind of visible. And they escalated this massive aerial bombardment of mostly southern Lebanon, but also large parts of Beirut, launched this ground invasion. And it was during this period that Hezbollah suffered perhaps its biggest loss when they killed Nasrallah, and this really sent shockwaves throughout the region. But they also lost many top commanders, many of their rank and file. And so Hezbollah is at a kind of a very critical point at this moment. It's also changing Lebanon's political landscape, as Hezbollah is its juggernaut, but it's been weakened. And so its opponents, both inside of Lebanon and internationally, are seeking to further weaken it and marginalize it as a group.
Sharif, in a moment, we're going to hear your interview with a top Hezbollah member of parliament in Lebanon. But just real briefly, by way of background, there recently was the formation of a new government in Lebanon. The president now, Joseph Aoun, was the commander of the Lebanese armed forces and someone that for many years the United States was hoping could become Lebanon's president. And so, people should understand this, that there is a long relationship there. Both the United States and Israel have been in long-term agreement that the best way to combat Hezbollah is to turn the Lebanese armed forces into a Western-supported counterterrorism force that is going to disarm Hezbollah. And in fact, and Aoun is walking a tightrope. In the way that he's presented this to the Lebanese public and the world. In his initial speech, he said that the state is going to reclaim its monopoly on arms, meaning that only the Lebanese armed forces can have weapons. Trump's new envoy, she went there to Lebanon and kind of stunned people when she said that our red line is Hezbollah can't be in the government. Now, that didn't exactly happen, but Hezbollah's influence has been quite significantly curbed in recent times. Address some of that and then introduce Ibrahim al-Moussawi, who is a leading member of parliament representing Hezbollah, a longtime member of the Hezbollah movement.
Yeah, we just saw on Wednesday the parliament vote. The government won a confidence vote in parliament on Wednesday with the backing of a majority in the chamber. This was a government that Prime Minister Nawaf Salam appointed last month in the wake of the ceasefire. And Hezbollah's bloc in parliament backed this government. They voted for it. But what was key to understand was that the statement that was adopted by Parliament said that exactly what you were referring to, that only Lebanon's armed forces should defend the country, which is the same thing as a monopoly of arms. And it didn't include the phrase, which is usually included, the armed resistance, which is a term that legitimizes Hezbollah's possession of weapons outside of state control. And so that wasn't in there. And so certainly there are these moves to try and marginalize Hezbollah. But yes, Ibrahim al-Moussawi is an important figure. He's an important voice. He was the spokesperson for Hezbollah. He's a leading member of the parliament representing Hezbollah's bloc. He's a very prominent figure, well recognized. We first met him the day after Nasrallah's funeral in Dir Qanoun, which is the hometown of Nasrallah's successor, who was also killed a few days later, Hashim Safieddin. And he had came to pay his respects at the funeral. But we actually met up with him later that evening in Beirut, in Dahia. This is the southern suburb of Beirut that is Hezbollah's stronghold, where Nasrallah was killed. We were standing not far. It was very badly hit, this area. We were standing not far from a demolished building. We had to do the interview in the street. But it's an important voice to hear. It's not one you usually hear at all, especially in U.S. media. And especially in this moment also, where Lebanon's political landscape is potentially shifting.
Let's go to your interview, Sharif Abdel Kouddous, with Dr. Ibrahim al-Moussawi.
Ibrahim al-Moussawi, member of the Lebanese parliament, representing Hezbollah parliamentary bloc from Baalbek district.
Yesterday there was a massive funeral for Sayyid Hassan Nasrallah. We saw a very big turnout. In addition to mourning Nasrallah, was this also a show of strength by Hezbollah?
Well, if you want to understand deeply what was it all about. You can talk about combination and so many different issues all together, molding down into this pot, if we can say. First of all, you're talking about a whole society community that is completely devoted and dedicated to the idea, to the concept of the resistance. Because we live in a part of the world where the world conspiracy, if you want, the world hegemony, the occupation, the expansionist tendency of the Israeli enemy is there always, all of the time. Part of our land has been occupied, and part of our land has already been occupied also after this war. So you're talking more or less about people who are under occupation, who are under oppression, who are under continuous target aggression from the Israeli side, supported by the Americans. And yesterday, you know, they said, we have done with Hezbollah. Hezbollah has been destroyed. They have no people around them. No one supports Hezbollah anymore because their community has been destroyed, their houses, their neighborhoods, their villages, whatever. And Hezbollah is not capable of assisting them to rebuild whatever. So it's okay, now we want to dictate our policies in Lebanon. And then to their shock and to their surprise, you're talking about one of the unprecedented rallies in the history of Lebanon and maybe in the region. If you take it proportionally, you will see that when you have more than 1 million people marching into the streets to mourn their leader, to send a message of strength, a message of solidarity, a message of assistance, a message of support, a message of belief, a message of loyalty, a message of faithfulness to the resistance, then this tell you who has been the loser actually. All of the destruction that Israel has done didn't do it any well. The people are there supporting the resistance. The resistance is a concept, the resistance is an idea. It is a belief in the hearts, in the minds, in the consciousness of the people, and they can come back together and rebuild their capabilities. And this is what was all the message about yesterday.
Hezbollah did suffer significant losses in this war, not only the loss of Nasrallah, but many top commanders, many rank and file. What does this mean for the future role of Hezbollah in Lebanon?
Actually, when you talk about the losses of Hezbollah, it's very apparent Hezbollah was not lying and did say that we have been dealt blows, very devastating ones, because we lost our leader, our top commanders, thousands of people who were wounded because of that pager, this war crime that is being designated as a war crime because it has never been precedented also in the history of the wars. But at the same time, I tell you, we go back to the same concept and idea. If you are right and you are fighting the oppression and the wrong, would you stop fighting the wrong or the aggression and the occupation and the oppression? Would you stop fighting it because you have lost, you have paid very huge losses? You will not stop that because it's a matter of belief, it's a matter of existence. It is the pivotal role of your community to fight back, because we didn't see anyone supporting, protecting, and helping us. Not the international community, not the Security Council, not the United Nations, not the powerful powers in the world, the superpowers that have always boasted about human rights. And now we have the right of existence, just to exist, because the Israelis were carrying out genocides. So I believe, yes, we got huge losses, but this is not going to change our belief and our steadfastness and our continuation of the resistance.
The Trump administration has said that Hezbollah being a part of the Lebanese government is a red line. What's your response to that?
Look, when we talk about democracy, we talk about the free choices of the people. We are constituency, we are part and bulk of this community. When you believe in democracy, is it like decontextualized democracy here, not democracy there? I mean, who is Trump to dictate his policies upon us? Who has given him the right to say what's right and what's wrong? Who has given him the right to say what are the red lines and what are the green lines? It's a red line for Trump and for all of the dictators and the hegemons of the world to dictate their policies upon us or upon any free, independent society. So it's a red line for him to do it, and he's trespassing so many different red lines. This is something that has to do with his opinion. He can keep it for himself, while here we are an independent, sovereign country, we are an independent, sovereign society, and we have the right to exercise our rights in democracy and in being represented in the government and in the parliament and all the political life in the country.
The US has been agitating for quite some time now for Joseph Aoun to be president, and it's quite clear that the US and Israel want the Lebanese military to serve as a so-called counter-terror force to confront Hezbollah militarily. What's your response to that?
General Joseph Aoun has been elected by the Lebanese parliament. We were part of the society who elected the president, and all the support for the presidency and for the Lebanese army to protect Lebanon, to keep the Lebanese state sovereign and protected and in its full dignity for the Lebanese government and for the people as well. When you talk about the Lebanese military, who is the Lebanese military? Who is the Lebanese army? You're talking about my father was in the army, my brother is in the army, my another brother is in the army, my nephew is in the army. So you're talking about our community. The Lebanese army is built of all the constituencies of the country. There are Muslims, Sunnis and Shiites and Druzes, they are Christians. So it is a reflection of the society. You cannot annihilate a society or whatever. And is it going to fight itself? The army is not going to be the service at the service of the Americans or of the Israelis or any other country in the world. The Lebanese army, with all due respect and with all full support, is inshallah, hopefully, will be able to protect our country and will be able also to liberate the occupied parts of the country. This is what the army's role all about. And I believe the president now, who has been the leader of the army, and the leader of the army will do everything possible to make sure that Lebanon will continue to be, or will be sovereign, independent, and will serve its own people. We are part of the people.
But Joseph Aoun has called for the Lebanese army to have a monopoly of arms, which would essentially mean disarming Hezbollah. Where do you stand on that?
When you talk about monopoly of arms in the hands of the army, this is the right of every country, of every state. You go and read it in the books, in the political books. It's the alphabet of a sovereign state. This is not the issue. Look, when you talk about Hezbollah and the resistance, we're not in love with fighting. We're not in love with holding arms or keeping arms. We are part of the society that the state, the government, the army fell short to protect. The army was there protecting us, fighting the Israelis, keeping our country sovereign, and we came and said, no, stay alone, we want to fight. It's not the way, actually. What happened is that there was a void, a vacancy. The army was not doing its role, not because the army didn't want to do it, because I'm still talking to you, the army is our people, is the community, the sons of the community. What happened actually is that our governments, and I don't know if you heard about it, it has always been the slogan that Lebanon's strength is in its weakness. Lebanon's strength is in its weakness. And we came to make another equation, another formula, that Lebanon's strength, it's the army, the people, and the resistance, you see? So now when we talk about disarming or arming, the president himself, who has been the leader of the army as well, he talked that we will going to study the issue of the Lebanese arms, or of the Lebanese resistance having arms, is going to be discussed within the Lebanese parameters. This is a sovereign issue that has to be studied, has to be examined, has to be discussed, has to be negotiated between the Lebanese themselves, and not with the outside dictation from any foreign power in the outside. That's why I tell you this is something that we are open to discuss. When you talk about the monopoly of arms, you talk about a mission for these arms. Why the arms? Why do we need the arms? Why do we need it? Do we need it in order to tip the balance inside Lebanon? Of course not. We have always used it to protect our country, and it served for 20 years. We protected our country, we have liberated parts of our occupied territories, and we made very strong equations, solid equations to stand up for the Israelis. Now, when we talk about monopoly of the army, fine, great, we welcome that, but it goes line by line with the protection. When the Lebanese government and when the Lebanese army is capable of protecting Lebanon, protecting the Lebanese, having the Lebanese people, their villages that are under occupation are liberated and they can go back and build and whatever, then we have the arms has no role to play, and the Lebanese army will do the whole mission. They should go line by line, and then there is no problem.
When you're speaking about resistance, how would you characterize right now the axis of resistance? Nasrallah has been killed. We've seen a limited response from Iran. There's the fall of Bashar al-Assad. Does the axis of resistance really exist in the same way anymore?
Just to be realistic here, I mean, when we talk about the axis of the resistance, people have gone so far in describing it the way they like to describe it, as if there is an axis of resistance that coordinating all together and doing the same thing at the same time and making the necessary connection and coordination. This was not the situation, actually. There was an axis of resistance, and it's going to continue to exist, but not in the same way or the way that has been described to the people, actually. Because, for example, when you talk about Iran, nobody has expected Iran to go into a full-fledged war against the Israelis. Even Syria, we have said this for the people before the demise of the Assad regime, actually, or the Syrian regime. We said that if Syria continues to be as is now, then this is more than great, because we do understand the sensitivities and the situation of every individual country. For example, Iraq is doing what it can do, Syria is doing what it can do, Yemen is doing what it can do. So it's not the same thing that you expect from people. Because of the descriptions that took place, we thought that there should be a full-fledged war, an opening of the whole fronts against the Israeli army, which is not actually the situation. Now, I can tell you the very important issue is that the people of the region who are aware of the American aggression, American conspiracies against the region, and the Israeli attacks and oppression and aggression and occupation, they are steadfast together and they support each other. And you know now that Yemen has clearly said that they are going to interfere in case the ceasefire has been violated in Gaza, or in case Lebanon has suffered any kind of anything. Iraq is ready in a certain way or another, but we do not hold people responsible for things that they cannot do.
Speaking about the ceasefire in Gaza, negotiations for phase 2 have not even begun. Israel is agitating to begin the war again. Will Hezbollah respond in the same way if the ceasefire falls apart?
When you talk about Gaza now, and there is a ceasefire that has been going on, when you talk about Lebanon itself, let's start by Lebanon. The Israelis have been violating the ceasefire hundreds of times. Everybody knows that. You know what happened yesterday with their fighter jets coming over the stadium where we were holding the funeral of Sayyid Nasrallah, which is a violation, a breach, a violent and blatant violation of the ceasefire and for the sovereignty of Lebanon. I mean, where is the international community? Now the government has took control, and we accepted what the government has signed of an agreement at the ceasefire. We will give an opportunity. We will rebuild our capabilities, and we will examine the situation very closely and in a very responsible way and in a very serious way, which will boil down to the interest of the whole country. But then let's give the opportunity for the international community, for our government, for our army to do its part in this. And after that, we can say what we're going to do.
Israel continues to occupy 5 positions inside Lebanon. If that occupation continues, will Hezbollah respond?
Yesterday, our Secretary General Sheikh Naim Qasim said that we're giving the opportunity for the government, for the international community, and we will observe what's really going on to happen. And after that, we will take the position and the decision that we feel necessary to protect our country.
That was Ibrahim al-Moussawi, a member of the Lebanese parliament representing Hezbollah, a very important figure throughout the past years in that movement. He was speaking to Dropsite News' Sharif Abdel Kouddous. You can check out all of Sharif's reporting from Lebanon, including a collaborative project we did with our friends at Democracy Now!, a 10, 11-minute video report that Sharif did that you can see the extent of this devastation in the villages and areas Sharif visited in southern Lebanon, and also footage from that massive funeral for the late Hezbollah Secretary General Hassan Nasrallah. And that does it for this episode. Make sure to follow us on our podcast feed. You can search Dropsite News wherever you get your podcasts. We also have a section on our webpage where you can find links to all of your favorite podcast apps or our RSS feed if you like to go more open source with things. Also, please leave a rating wherever you do listen to this podcast. It helps other people to find us. Our show today was produced by our friend and colleague, Jose Olivares. Make sure to check out his excellent reporting at dropsitenews.com about the Trump administration's sending of migrants to the U.S.-run prison camp at Guantanamo Bay, Cuba. If you want to support our work, you can subscribe to dropsitenews.com. We don't put things behind a paywall, but your voluntary paid subscriptions make sure that our journalism continues and continues strong. You can also make a 501c3 tax-deductible donation to our work by going to dropsitenews.com. You can click on Ways to Give. Make sure to follow us on all social media platforms. Tell your friends, your foes about our work. Until next time, I'm Jeremy Scahill with my friend and colleague, Sharif Abdel Kouddous. Thank you so much for listening.